Welcome to It's Our Money with Ellen Brown. A look behind the curtain of global finance and monetary control with one of the foremost experts in the field. Author of the bestseller Web of Debt and the Public Bank Solution, Ellen Brown's groundbreaking work began the movement to create new American public banks. We'll look at issues surrounding the world of money and the systems and powers that control it, as well as the progress being made on the public banking frontier. The program is underwritten by Public Banking Associates, a national consultancy of experts advising government leaders pursuing creation of their own public banks at publicbankingassociates.com.
In this speech, the dean of the Yale Business School said, if our work in the Graduate School of Business is about training hands to do well by society and hearts to increase the common good, then a business school has a place in the academy. If, on the other hand, our aim is to train brains to manipulate money, to create artificial wealth through purely economic gain, we are writing the seed of our destruction.
That's our featured guest today, Dr. Ed Quevedo, talking about what constitutes a legitimate grounding for business school studies, at least from a perspective of purpose. This inquiry is all the more timely now as social, environmental, and economic crises of varying types develop around the world. Is business at its heart about the making of money? Or might that bottom line mentality work against the sustainability of the true global economy? Hello, and welcome to It's Our Money with Ellen Brown. I'm Walt McCree, Ellen's co-host and senior advisor to the Public Banking Institute. Today, we're going to talk about a couple of related approaches to our money and business and the essential role of a regenerative philosophy in both. We'll be getting into the dirt on this, so wear overalls. As you'll hear in our conversation with Professor Quevedo, the true common thread that underlies our economic truths is one that is typically not discussed or even factored by the wisdom of the market, if one can call it that. That binding truth is the understanding that the earth and its systems of sustainability underlie all other economic forms from the standpoint of their civic legitimacy and sustainability, and that the introduction of money as a commodity that quantifies value is a superficial distraction that has replaced our native and deep sense of stewardship, as we frequently see demonstrated in indigenous economies. Consequently, when we're confronted with market failures in which necessary goods are not available or inequitably distributed, the answers we rush to are fabricated around cost rather than commitment, as in, can we afford to rescue populations that are in need from some disaster, rather than saying, well, of course, we're going to invest whatever's necessary to help the citizens of, say, Puerto Rico or Haiti or a host of other locales. Money as the sole object of business misses the greater purpose and obligation of business to serve a commonwealth. But that's a sort of quaint notion in this financialized haze that we find ourselves in. You'll find Professor Quevedo's discussion of regenerative and sustainable economies and banking enlightening. Our own star economist and monetary guru, Ellen Brown, has been turning things upside down a bit herself with her latest discussions about dirt. And I'm not talking about dirty money. Ellen has been on the road a lot lately and has been digging into the dirt of relationship between dirt and banking. Let's connect with her now.
Well, Ellen, I don't know if you're claiming any part of the planet as home since you've been moving around so much. Tell us about your latest exploits and how public banking and global finance comes into play here.
Well, in the last 10 weeks, I've hit like 8 different cities doing PowerPoints and in-person interviews, and we attended a press conference by the New Jersey governor who just announced that he was forming a task force for a public bank, and met with some local legislators. So anyway, I've done a lot of traveling, which does show that public banking is in high demand at the moment or has generated a great deal of interest. So that was mostly the topic of all that. But what my latest article was on was something I learned about at one conference that I presented at, which was the Bionutrient Conference in Southbridge, Massachusetts, which is very interesting. So my article, which I'm just now finishing up, is called Soil, Not Oil is the Key to Solving the Environmental Crisis. So what I learned from them, I mean, these were a lot of farmers and people very interested in agriculture, was that we don't need to give up all those things that we think we need to give up in order to save the planet, that the cheapest, most efficient and fastest way to get carbon back in the soil, the carbon dioxide is the alleged villain in all this, and assuming that's true, which is also debatable, but I mean, it's certainly a problem that we have polluted air, polluted water, polluted oceans, I mean, our health is not good. We've got toxins in our bodies. And so their solution is to just get the carbon back in the soil. And the most efficient way to do that has been devised by nature herself over millions of years, and that's through plants. So that would be trees, of course, and regular plants, and the microorganisms in the soil are actually a major part of this cycle. And we've killed the microorganisms in the soil by our forms of farming. So we plow too deeply, and that kills the microorganisms. And then, of course, the pesticides and artificial fertilizers that are just depleting the soil of any, of robbing it of nutrients and making it so it can't absorb water. So actually, apparently, it rains everywhere. I mean, there is enough rain that you can turn the deserts green. But the problem is the deserts don't hold water. That's why they're deserts, and you can fix that by these regenerative farming techniques, which were very interesting. And one interesting thing is that you can incorporate, or that you actually need cattle and sheep and all those animals that used to be blamed for destroying the soil. Well, they do destroy the soil if you keep the cattle all penned up in one place so that they're on the same land all the time. But if you move them around the way nature used to do it, where you would have like buffalo roaming the plains and deer and cattle and elephants and all those big animals that would move around from place to place, then they're actually part of the natural cycle, and you need that. Because the manure is good for the soils, and they keep the weeds down, basically, if you integrate them into your farming methods, and the soil itself needs to be packed down a bit. Anyway, so they're actually an essential part of the cycle, but you've got to move them around. So it's called managed grazing, where it's really a science to do it in the right way. So they have all these ways of now of very quickly turning the soil back into holding a lot of carbon, which is where it belongs. Carbon is what, I mean, it's not the only place it belongs. Of course, plants need to breathe carbon dioxide too, but you need that carbon in the soil in order to make the woody parts of plants, and we too incorporate carbon into our bones and so forth. So anyway, it's actually an essential element, but it belongs in plant and animal life, and not making our air toxic. So that was all very interesting, and that's what I wrote up.
Well, it was interesting to me to come across this fellow who, I guess, a botanist or an agronomist in Africa, who developed this theory over years. I don't know what part of Africa he was from, but he was looking at the land that was desertifying, which apparently is a condition that's happening all over the planet in various broad swaths. And after looking at, you suggested, the other issues that we typically look at, like factory farming and so forth, he said the only way that we can turn this around is to do this very intentional pasture development that involves the grazing of cattle, which, when you looked at the video, made it pretty clear that the defecation and the urination of the cattle and the hooves that were digging up the soil turned this barren ground into green-covered areas, which, as you say, absorbed the water and stimulated all kinds of plant growth and absolutely transformed the landscape. And it was his strong opinion that that would be really the only way and the most effective way for us to recover this natural cycle.
Yeah, I saw that video too, and he said that he felt very guilty, like the most devastating thing he ever did in his life was he was largely responsible for killing 40,000 elephants because the theory used to be that they were bad for the land, and he was trying to protect the plant life.
Yeah.
So, science changes
from
year to year or from decade to decade.
And he loves animals. It was just really a heartbreaking kind of a circumstance. So, how does banking and how does the world of finance intersect with this reclamation of natural cycles?
Well, I was invited to that conference to speak on how we could fund the Green New Deal, or what they called it was the green transition, because they don't all necessarily agree with the Green New Deal, being farmers, who tend to be conservative Republicans. So what I spoke on was a deep dive into money and banking, just because you've got to understand how the whole system works before you understand why it is that we really can tap up the Federal Reserve. I mean, just create the money on the books, and Fed should work with Congress in the same way that they do in Japan, where under Japanese banking law it actually says that the Ministry of Finance, or in other words the Treasury or whatever, the government should work with the central bank. So what the government does under Abenomics is the Prime Minister says, we want to build this, that, and the other, and we're going to issue bonds to fund it, and we want you, the central bank, to buy it. So the Bank of Japan has actually bought out 50% they now own or hold 50% of the government's debt, and still you would think that would be inflationary. I mean, if we did that, that means the Fed would buy $11 trillion worth of bonds, and everybody would say, oh no, that's going to hyperinflate the system. But in fact, in Japan, they're still at 1% consumer price index. They can't even get it up to 2%, which is what they're trying to do. So obviously that is not going to do it. And then what I argued a lot about was that we actually need more money out there. There's not enough money in the real productive consumer economy, the place where things are manufactured and produced, because debt always necessarily grows faster than the money supply, since we now know that banks create money on their books when they lend, and that's where most of our money comes from. And they create the principal but not the interest, so that's one reason there's not enough money out there. Another reason is that a lot of people save the money, even that was created in principal. So you might think of saving it under mattresses, but mostly they put it in things like the stock market, which explains why the stock market keeps going up and up, although everybody says that it makes no sense, that the businesses that they're pumping money into aren't that productive, or the money's going back to buy out the company's own stock, et cetera, and still the market goes up and up. Why is that? Because people just keep pumping their money in there. They're not making any interest to speak of off their deposits in a bank, and so they move it into the stock market instead. So it's a big casino, and it doesn't really hurt if it goes up and up, because you can always jump in at any time, like with any casino, and if you're lucky, your stock will continue to go up.
This whole inflating of the financial figures around the world are a product of this interest, this debt extraction and expansion from private issuance of money. And Bloomberg had an article in the past week that talked about the global debt crisis and what's the solution. And I believe they're talking about $250 trillion of global debt. What's the solution? They suggest more debt. They have no place to go. They're propping up this system of private capital and in adding interest constantly is completely unsustainable, and yet it just looks like no one's willing to get off, of course. The parties that are profiteering off of the system are not going to get off it, like the Federal Reserve, for example. But they have to, don't they? I mean, if we're ever going to have what Hudson calls, a debt jubilee, that's absolutely critical for us to move on.
There's only one way to get rid of debt. You either got to write it off, which you're never going to get the banks to do because they're private, although they could do it if they were public, which is exactly what the Chinese do. I mean, they just let it sit on their books as non-performing loans. I just did an interview yesterday that was largely about China. It was Jeff Brown, who's written on this subject quite a bit. And he says there's no way that the Chinese banks are going to go bankrupt because the regulators are the government, and the government owns the banks. They don't have to put their banks into bankruptcy. They can just let them carry these non-performing loans on their books. And that's what they do, which is the equivalent of a debt jubilee. But we're probably not going to do that. So the other alternative is to pump more money in, get the money out there to pay off the loans, because money is created as a loan and it's extinguished when the loan is paid off. So if you put the money out there, that money is going to disappear along with the debt. It won't inflate the system. It'll just go back to zero and get rid of some of the debt.
So we're stuck with the system. The Federal Reserve System for 100 years has been ruling this roost, not just here, but globally, as part of the central bank matrix of control. That can't continue, and so we must take that over. So part of the public banking movement has to ultimately have a focus on nationalizing the Federal Reserve, yes?
Yes, some people think that we want to get rid of the Federal Reserve, but we need that. We need the deep pocket of the Fed. We can have state banks, and that's certainly what we've been arguing for, state and local publicly owned banks. And they can create money on their books in the same way that all banks do, but it's created as a debt and it's got to be paid off. They are subject to the same restrictions that other banks are, whereas the Federal Reserve, the central bank, can create money as much as it likes, and it doesn't have to balance its books, and it certainly doesn't balance its books. It's got $4 trillion sitting there now that they've created, and they're not counting it as a debt on the other side of the. Well, I guess they do, but they don't have to pay off the debt. Technically they count it as a debt, but nobody's saying you've got to pay that $4 trillion back. When they do, they create the money to do it. So.
Yeah, and watching what the Federal Reserve is doing now, pumping billions of dollars every week into the repo market to support the bank balance sheets that are really bankrupt, way over-leveraged, hundreds of times over-leveraged from where they should be. They're just propping up this system. I don't see what the future is for that industry, except, I suppose, a collapse. But, I mean, when you look at a crystal ball, what's going to happen with this hugely inflated capital market that the Fed is sustaining? It works.
I mean, the reason the Fed has stepped in was that J.P. Morgan pulled out. They pulled out the same number of billions that the Fed stepped in to supply the repo market. It used to be that banks, we know that banks don't have the money that they lend, and so where are they going to get it? They borrow it. And if they can, they'll borrow it from their depositors, but if they don't have the deposits, then they used to borrow from the Fed funds market. And so the Federal Reserve, that was the only thing it could control, manipulate the interest rates on, so they would set a target for the Fed funds rate. But now the banks don't borrow in the Fed funds market much at all. First of all, they don't trust each other since the 2008 collapse. Nobody knows where the bodies are buried. And so they go into the repo market instead, which is considered to be securitized. It's really like a big pawn shop where one party owns the security and then sells it to the other party overnight, but the deal is that they'll buy it back in the morning. So if one party goes bankrupt, the other party's got the security and just snatches it and doesn't have to go through bankruptcy court. That's the whole idea. But what it means, first of all, you've got the problem that you can use that security more than once, which is called rehypothecation. So it's sort of like fractional rate reserve lending, where they're making loans upon loans upon loans, creating money out of nothing. And this is in the shadow banking system, so it's not even regulated. And then the Fed has to step into the repo market in order to maintain a floor. It's very complicated, and I've written whole chapters on it, to maintain a floor on their Fed funds rate so it won't go below what the lowest repo level is. So that's why the Fed jumps into the repo market, and everybody knows that they'll jump in. And so they're doing all kinds of risky things, knowing that they can always borrow from the Fed or from the repo market because they know the money will be there, because if JP Morgan pulls their money out, as they did, to rebuy their own stocks because it was more profitable for them, that's their mandate, to make as much profit as they can. So they pulled their money out, so the Fed jumped in. Everybody knew they would. So now you've got like hedge funds and entities that aren't supposed to be eligible to borrow at the Fed's own lending window. They are now borrowing in a repo market that's being propped up by the Fed. So it's working for them. It's not like it's going to collapse, and it's not a sign that there's there may be some big bank that's bankrupt, but it's not because of that. They're doing it because JP Morgan just decided to pull their deposits out and use them for something else, and the Fed has this very skewed idea that their sole purpose in life is to maintain their 2% Fed funds rate at all costs, or around 2%.
Well, by bankrupt, I meant they're not able to cover their loans. You know.
Yeah. But I mean, a lot of people are saying, it means that somebody's about to go bankrupt and we're on the edge of another 2008. But that's not what it means. All it means is that JP Morgan pulled their money out, and so the Fed jumped in because they have this idea that they have to preserve their target interest rates.
Well, we're stuck with mentalities that don't work, but at least not for the people anyway.
Yeah, but sooner or later we will have some sort of another collapse, and so hopefully that will be our opportunity, and that's the whole idea. The whole point of getting these ideas out there is that when they do collapse next time, the government has said they're not going to, no more bailouts, they're not going to bail out the banks, and the Fed, we're on to them, we see what they're doing, so hopefully the next time around they'll actually nationalize the big bankrupt banks, which would be good. That's what we're aiming for.
So between these two topics, the global world of financial fantasy and the regenerative aspects of soil reclamation and so forth, we're confronting established notions that we have been clinging to even though they don't work. We have to look at what works, see what's not working, and be willing to reclaim some of the basic principles that we've known all along, both in terms of agriculture, but also in terms of money and banking. I think we're at an interesting point where the stakes are so high, we better learn quickly what's not working and get on with the things that do.
I totally agree.
Yeah. Well, Ellen, I know you're off to Europe, and who knows what kind of trouble you'll cause over there, but we'll be listening.
All right. Great talking to you.
Thanks, Ellen.
Ellen and I were just discussing how the Federal Reserve has seemingly gone off the reservation by coming to the aid of its client banks, the large global ones anyway, in order to cover shortness on their balance sheets in overnight trading. The repo market, which she described, is apparently a sector of great profiteering by the banks, which typically lend to each other to cover end-of-day balances. But of late, they've been staying out of that role in deference to the use of the cheap money that the Federal Reserve gives them through these overnight loans. What's surprising, even shocking to many, is the scale at which the Fed is pumping in dollars for the banks, which now amount to hundreds of billions of dollars each week. Since September 17th, the Fed has allowed its New York branch to funnel approximately $3 trillion into the kitty. And whose kitty? Well, that's one of the big questions. They are unnamed trading houses on Wall Street, which receive these funds at interest rates of less than 2%. The banks that own these trading houses charge regular citizens, say, 17% when people borrow on their credit cards. So in case you haven't noticed previously, banking is one sweet franchise. But by whose authority did the Fed do this lending? It's not the first time the Fed has acted in this way, since during the post-2008 crisis, it dispensed $29 trillion in various forms of lending and supports for banks all over the world. This is why we always refer to a global banking cartel. The central banks and private banks the world over are interconnected. But as the authors of Wall Street on Parade, Pam and Russ Martins, from whose work we're sharing this report, points out, there have been no hearings or questions about the Fed's taking this action, just as they did their trillions of dollars of lending a few years ago after the banks collapsed our economies. While the Fed is authorized to provide cheap loans to primary banks, this latest round of largesse has been given to publicly traded trading houses that belong to the major Wall Street banks. The Martins put it this way: if a publicly traded company cannot obtain loans from anywhere other than the cheap money spigot of the Federal Reserve, it needs to publicly disclose that to its shareholders and potential buyers of its stock. That's a material fact that legally must be disclosed. The legal argument could be made that the Federal Reserve is aiding and abetting a fraud upon the investing public by failing to name the trading houses that are receiving these massive loans. The loans started out as just overnight loans, but they have since been morphed into 15-day and 42-day loans, which strongly suggests that one or more of these firms can't obtain long-term funding elsewhere. Continuing this quote, they say, the United States has historically bragged about its free and transparent markets, but what the Fed is doing today is pulling a dark curtain around the financing of this so-called free and transparent market. The public has no idea which Wall Street firms have received this $3 trillion or why they can't borrow it elsewhere. This kind of obfuscation by the Federal Reserve could actually stimulate distrust in the U.S. banking system, as has been noted by people in the Federal Reserve itself. End quoting. So here again we see how the practice of obscuring legally required facts and the unaccountable nature of the Federal Reserve begs the call for nationalizing that institution for the sake of public accountability, public interest, and clearly the Commonwealth. Propping up private banks that have maneuvered themselves into liquidity crises or are playing the profit margins of the federal system on their own and for their industry friends, we have a perverted and compromised central bank that is long past due for a thorough reevaluation and reimagination. The Fed is at the heart of the problem with our monetary system. It issues the money of the people at interest, thereby building a never-ending expansion of debt and its consequent product of inflation. The problem here, always, the private issuance of credit. So this is an interesting and ongoing story, even as we speak. So let us recommend that you go online and visit wallstreetonparade.com and sign up for their daily newsletter. Pam and Russ Martins are the authors. They've spent years on Wall Street, and they know how this game is being played. When you find out, you'll be amazed at the prize money that changes hands among the global banking manipulators, who also, of course, happen to own the governments of this world for the most part. Nationalizing the Fed would be a useful next step should the banks decide to, once again, collapse our economies. It's highly unlikely that you've ever come across a mainstream media outlet talking about economy in terms of dirt, unless, of course, you're paying attention to hog or grain futures. or ag business issues of one sort or another. And yet, as Ellen pointed out in her report on the bionutrient conference she spoke to, soil, the basis of all agriculture, is a far more important resource and element of our survival and economy than we've realized. Not only does soil and agriculture provide life-sustaining foods, but it also apparently holds the key for reclaiming some of the imbalances of our Earth's current state of health, which our fossil-fueled economy and military exploits have consumed. But it isn't just soil or land reclamation that needs to be reprioritized within our economies. It's really more about a philosophy of regeneration that provides sustainability by definition. That is, it doesn't exploit, extract, or monopolize. It collaborates, nurtures, and replenishes. Our guest today is Professor Ed Quevedo, who directs the Regenerative Design Program within the Foresight and Innovation Lab, a collaborative advisory and creative agency working to build the new regenerative economy. The new regenerative economy, a fundamental reframing of the conventional consumer economy. I asked him to tell us why we aren't familiar with this economic formulation.
Well, we're familiar with the regenerative economy. We just don't see it in those terms. The regenerative economy is all around us. We see it when we're driving through places of nature. The original regenerative economy is the fruits of nature that are provided as a function of biological processes that support life on the planet. And we have become arrogant and misled in our modern day, thinking that it's the ingenuity of mankind that gives us this vast material economy and all the things and stuff that we have around us that make our so-called modern life so-called comfortable. It's really alienating us from who we are. And in fact, the greatest public health crisis to face us as a species is the global material economy. It's literally killing us because we misunderstand that the entire material economy, Walt, is based on photosynthesis. The gifts of nature give us all the raw materials necessary to produce the material economy. And the pace at which we're making stuff, the pace at which we're extracting the fruits of nature from the planet, is causing radical dislocations, the collapse of ecosystems, and ultimately the shift in our climate. And if we don't stop it, nature will say of mankind or humanity, that was a bad experiment. We'll push reset, and she will eliminate us and try again. The regenerative economy has its place in the modern world in affectionate exchanges. And I'll give you one simple example. The gentleman who repairs my boot heels, I wear boots because I ride horses, is a gentleman that I've known now for almost 20 years. He runs a little shop in a town called Mountain View. I've met his family. I've met his children. I have been to his home, and when I pay him to repair my boots, I pay a little bit more than I would pay if I went to a chain cobblery. But when I give him money, it goes straight to his family and his children's well-being, and it's an affectionate exchange. If I were to go to a generic corporate-owned chain cobblery, I wouldn't know the person, and it would be a purely transactional matter. But the regenerative economy is based on the idea that when I engage in commercial exchange, I simultaneously create net gains, net measurable gains in ecological, social, and economic well-being. Now, those are very different concepts, and I'm happy to unpack it, but imagine if every transaction from the material I buy to transport me around to my mortgage to the education I buy for my children was that kind of affectionate exchange, and that with every transaction, every person on the planet was generating net measurable gains in ecological, social, and economic well-being. The problem, and I'll stop here, Walt, is that right now in the global conventional material economy, we are doing exactly the opposite. 99.999% of economic exchanges degrade real economic well-being, ecological well-being, and social well-being.
Photosynthesis is really at the source of our wealth, our common wealth, you say. But it's interesting that you point out that in business, as in nature, extinction is the rule, not the exception. So this isn't a trivial matter we're talking about here. In what ways are we stepping over that line with our current system?
I only need to tell you that the statistics just in the United States tell us that 80% of businesses that are started fail, which is fine. In nature, the natural scientists and biologists tell us that almost the exact same percentage of species that nature tries fail. Why is that the case? Because nature's model is prototyping. When she has to fill a new ecological niche, think about the extinction of the dinosaurs and we need a new capstone predator to evolve, she experiments. In industry, entrepreneurship is fundamentally an experimental gesture, but it's not what it used to be. There was a time, Walt, in the United States when the titans of industry would talk about just what you did. They would say, we have to work for the Commonwealth. In fact, the dean of the first business school in the United States, which was at Yale, said in a speech when he was trying to make the case to his faculty to create the first business school in the country, and I'm paraphrasing from a book, the book is called From Higher Aims to Hired Hands. In this speech, the dean of the Yale Business School said, if our work in the Graduate School of Business is about training hands to do well by society and hearts to increase the common good, then a business school has a place in the academy. If, on the other hand, our aim is to train brains to manipulate money, to create artificial wealth through purely economic gain, we are writing the seed of our destruction.
Wow.
And that's exactly what's happening.
Yeah, and it's so true. So we've commodified the exchange between us as opposed to humanized it. To most people, I think that doesn't sound very practical because they can only think in the matrix of commodities and exchanges of physical entities, whereas these other values that you brought in of health and happiness, well-being, and humanity have been ignored. When we talk about banking, Ed, we, of course, have been discussing the public bank protocol and methodology. How is it that banking expresses the values, or could express the values, that you're referring to?
I think that's an angle of approach we should explore, because people will say on first hearing the things I'm talking about, and I've been told by fancy PhD-toting economists who are on faculties that I've been on, and by world-class executives in large banks, that these ideas are naive. And I take that seriously because these people have degrees and letters and experience that I don't have, but I also think that they are true. The most profitable bank in all of the Netherlands, which is a pretty well-run country, by any measure, margins, reinvestment, growth pace, number of investors, is a little bank called Triodos Bank. I should say it's not the largest, it's the healthiest. Not the largest in terms of turnover, but in terms of its margins, the length of time people have deposits with it. Triodos Bank is the most commercially successful by all conventional economic measures. It is a philanthropically owned bank created by a group of expats from Rabobank in 1996, and they left Rabobank to see if they could create a bank that generated net well-being rather than profit. So they created a philanthropy to hold the bank to solve a problem. Our work in the Foresight Lab, our work in the world, when we're teaching, all of it is trying to solve the problem of our alienation from nature and each other as fellow creatures. What they wanted to do with this bank was ask, could we generate net measurable gains in community well-being rather than profit? And Triodos Bank was launched, and it's been copied by the good folks at Beneficial State Bank, Tom Steyer and Cat Stevens. It's been copied by our friends at Amalgamated. And this banking model fundamentally changes one's relationship with money. We talk about, well, money circulating. It's like blood. When it moves in the economy at speed with good intention, it nourishes. Mm-hmm. It creates opportunities, economic opportunities. It creates education. It creates art. When money is held by the scions of industry in big conventional banks, it gets stale and it rots because it sits in piles to make the rich richer and to immiserate the poor. And that crushing gap is the direct result of our material economy. If we reinvent banking in relationships, and if our banking relationships are affectionate, like I talked about before, banks become a whole different thing. And if you think about the wonderful movie,
It's a Wonderful Life.
A Wonderful Life, that little loan and trust that Jimmy Stewart's character runs is fighting with this titanic bank that wants to gobble it up. And that's exactly what we're talking about. I think banks, and you know that banks that are publicly oriented for the common wealth and the common good can be equally profitable to or better on conventional measures, but do good in the world rather than create harm.
Yeah, much more profitable in many instances. I mean, for example, our model public bank, the Bank of North Dakota, outperforms Wall Street 2-to-1 in terms of its return on equity. It has the least amount of risk. Return on equity has been 17 to 26% for the last 12 years. Pretty high marks. Well, there are some other banks that you mentioned, and we have some graphics here. I see the Triodos Bank logo says, make your money make a difference. And you mentioned Beneficial and Amalgamated. Amalgamated Bank out of New York, now a national bank, was started by the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, only to serve that community. It's all been about commitment to public well-being and public trust. So there's strength and vitality and a certain affection for each other that's implicit in that as well. Tell us about RSF, Reimagine Money. What is that in the monetary scheme of things?
Well, as they say in jobs, we're going to need a bigger boat. We're going to need a bigger program if I'm going to fully unpack this, but I'll keep within boundaries.
Sure.
RSF Social Finance is a 38-year-old financial institution based here in the San Francisco Presidio. RSF stands for the Rudolf Steiner Foundation. Uh-huh. These ideas I've been talking about are Rudolf Steiner's brilliant insights into three fields of human endeavor: agriculture, education, and finance and economics. He saw them as the same. Rudolf Steiner's fundamental gesture was this threefolding of the world of finance, education, and agriculture. And if he said in the 1930s, the brilliant Austrian biologist / philosopher / economist, he said, if we do not reform the way we interact with each other and nature, we will end ourselves through our chase for artificial profit. Mm-hmm. Sort of troublesomely echoing the words of Professor Biddle, the founding dean of the Yale Law School. And the basic idea behind RSF is, let us create. The basic gesture is, let us have banking and financial exchange based on trust, good intention, and a long-term view of measurable gains in well-being. Mm-hmm. So RSF has three investment portfolios: education, ecology, and food and agriculture. When you think about it, those are the three things that make life worth living. Yeah. They are the three things that are at the rootstock of any healthy economy. They invest in such a way that completely delinks their activities from the global financial markets. Instead of using the LIBOR, extractive, punitive interest rate set by bankers in quiet, dark, hidden rooms, when they want to set their interest rates, they get the people that they invest in and their investors in a room, and they talk about need, human need. And they agree quarterly how to adjust the interest rate that the borrowers pay to the lenders. And if every bank in the world were based on that, we would suddenly find a way to solve every single complex ecological, social, and economic problem that we as a global society face. So we really have two choices: emulate RSF and Triodos and have an abundantly, joyfully, connectedly human future where the economy is based on inclusion, regeneration of nature, and abundance of well-being in the world, or continue on this path and face collapse of ecosystems, destruction of the climate cycle, and ultimately the extirpation of our species. To me, this is a pretty easy choice.
Yes, but as you say, an unsustainable path that we're on, which is one of the reasons that, of course, the public banking has come to the fore right now, because the cities and counties that are considering them are on an unsustainable path of more debt, of indebtedness. And there's no way, of course, they can borrow themselves out of debt. And simultaneously, there's no way that they can express or commit or enable their best sentiments, their best intentions to improve the economy and to improve the welfare of the people for whom they serve. So they're locked into a cycle of commodification of money that prevents them from using it. As you say, it's not a tough choice if we would only take it seriously. So this business about naivete is actually on the other foot. We're foolish if we think that it's not the case, that nature rules here, and that we better resonate and replicate and regenerate ourselves in our relationships. There's a new variation, one of the applications of money that you're involved with is the Perpetual Purpose Trust. Organically Grown Company is a large firm in California. Tell us what a Perpetual Purpose Trust is.
Organically Grown Company is a transformative natural produce company. They're actually based in Eugene with operations in Portland. And they work with RSF to take a model that we've been talking about for quite some time in the marketplace in another context, but RSF named it and built it and just took the idea and ran with it. In traditional terms, companies are held in one of two ways, to simplify. They're either held by an individual for that individual's profit, or they're held by a group of people for group profit. And they're hooked into the global material economy and banking and financial system that we've been talking about that's so problematic. The brilliant breakthrough of a perpetual purpose trust is it allows the holding of a company by a family or a community, much like Amalgamated, who have one thing in common, a mutual intention to create well-being in the world. And it actually creates disincentives to grow profit. The way that the tax structure of a perpetual purpose trust works is that you're rewarded for steady state operation. Steady state economics has been studied by James Daly and a variety of other economists, and they've said that it's the only future of the global material economy because it's nature's model. This is not a subtle, naive, fringe idea. It's quite central in the world of PhD-toting economists who talk about these issues. Now, PPT allows a business to operate on a steady state model, and to do so, you basically create incentives to grow slow, have intention, and do good. It goes way beyond a B corporation or even a benefit corporation to set up a permanent way of holding a business so that generations after generations of families, rather than being taxed on profit and being motivated to generate profit and artificial wealth, they actually generate well-being, do good in the world, and make a modest, sufficient profit. And I'll say that they exemplify something that we need, Walt, that I want to make sure to mention. People often see these conversations as conversations about policy reform. They're mistaken. This is a movement of social conscience that must suffuse our nation, and never has it been more important in the times that we are in now in the United States that we demand of every candidate running for public office, from the school board and the water board to the highest office in the land, that they make a commitment in their platform to pursue the regenerative economy and public banks and perpetual purpose trusts, and to hammer them by force of will, guile, and political process into the infrastructure of our nation, protect future generations against those who would hijack our future in ways that are happening right now. So if we take these ideas and convert them into the place where the future of our policies and society are forged, that is the world of elected office, we have a chance to make this real and to have it be as much a part of our everyday world as reporting on the Dow Jones Stock Exchange or any other government policy to get national attention.
Yeah, and I know you have some agendas around the international economic community, a plan to bring forward to, I believe you said, to Davos, that would involve carbon, an understanding of carbon as the new common currency. Tell us a little bit about how carbon fits in as a monetary, if you will, as a currency element.
Thank you. The idea comes from the fact that the Dutch ministries of climate and economy merged last year. And you would ask the question, why would a smart, progressive, intelligent, well-run country, one of the best economies in the world, merge their ministries of economics and climate? Well, I mean, it's not hard to figure out if you've been watching the long-term movie of our global economy. They realize that carbon is the new currency. If we trade carbon as an investment in our own future, and if we trade it in such a way as to make it negatively valued, we will gear down and actually reverse climate change over the long term. Right now, all we're trying to do is to slow the increase in climate change. Mm-hmm. The only way we can turn the gears backwards, save our species, and create well-being in the world is to take carbon and make it a negative commodity that is traded in such a way as to reverse its generation and create incentives to sequester and run every business in the world in such a way as that it must measurably each year reduce its carbon footprint or it's put out of business by law. And that's where the Netherlands is heading. So our goal is to go there this summer with governors of the U.S. Central Bank, with bankers, with PhD token economists, with students, with business leaders, and with other policy leaders. We are just beginning to plan this, but our hope is that we'll be welcomed by the Ministry of Climate and Economy in the Netherlands to study their model and to begin talking about this on a larger frame, and ultimately to take this message to the World Economic Forum in a few years, where the titans of industry, government, policy, science, and education gather to set the global course of the future of our global society, and tell them in no uncertain terms, the regenerative economy is what you must pursue, and if you don't, you are breaching the public trust as elected officials, fiduciaries of the future, and your social license to operate will evaporate before your very eyes if you don't pursue a path that generates plenty of economic well-being, but also heals the wounds of social and ecological dislocation that the material economy is causing, and using carbon as a negative trading commodity or currency is one of the key gears in changing that cycle.
And quickly, Ed, if I may ask you about how you see the public banking development and evolution serving that purpose. How do you see that playing out?
Thank you, Walt. In my estimation, every bank in the world needs to be converted by law into a public bank. We need to fundamentally change the regulations so that it's impossible for a bank to operate extractively. In the meantime, the propagation of the public bank movement, which you and your colleagues at PBI are leading, is essential to our future. It's more than interesting and helpful. It's those things for sure. It's more than inspiring and meaningful. It's those things. It is fundamentally essential to the health and survival of our nation and our species that we pursue public banks with all due vigor, because they're an exemplification of everything I've been talking about.
Well, Ed, that's all the time we'll have for, unfortunately, but thank you very much for that. I think that's really expanded a lot of thinking for a lot of us. It's a stark reality that the systems that we live in, the problem that we survive through and we tolerate is leading us to an unsustainable future, and that there are dimensions to our economy that go outside the bounds of money, currency exchange, and commodities, but really reside in natural processes, relationship between people, the talents, the prospects, the intention of communities to work together toward the benefit of humanity. A regenerative economy, perhaps, as you would like to say, an economy worthy of our affection. Ed, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Walt. It's always a delight. I appreciate you having me on.
That's Ed Quevedo, who is Professor of Practice and Innovation at Stanford University's School of Public Policy and Director of Regenerative Design. Well, that's it for this edition of It's Our Money with Ellen Brown. Our thanks to our guests, our sponsor, Public Banking Associates, and to you for listening. Be sure to check out Ellen's latest writings on the economy and the changing world of money by visiting ellenbrown.com. And for more information on public banking, visit publicbankinginstitute.org. For information on how local and state government leaders can obtain professional insight and counsel about public banks from key national experts, visit publicbankingassociates.com. I'm Walt McCree. See you next time on It's Our Money with Ellen Brown.